My lifelong fascination with machines designed to transport people and things over all different types of terrain has led me down some interesting roads of research, but this one may be the best yet. The Chrysler Defense Riverine Utility Craft. A behemoth of a machine powered by two 440 cubic inch big block Chrysler engines, each cranking out 380 horsepower apiece. Beyond that, it was moved by two massive screws that spiraled their way through the ground that the Riverine Utility Craft was sitting on. But like all things, the RUC wasn't the beginning of the story on experimental land vehicles motivated by screws, it was basically the end. So to understand the awesome nature of the RUC, we need to go back to the beginning, and it's a ways back there. To understand the stuff we're going to be checking out in this video, we have to go back to the days of ancient Greece and talk about Archimedes. The brilliant mathematician and philosopher invented many things, but for the purposes of this story, it's one thing we're concerned with. The Archimedean screw. Designed as a device to raise water from a lower level to a more elevated one, it was a shaft with a helix around it, which when turned would capture the water as it was rotated, and it would carry the water upward. Still used today in many forms around the world for moving water, it was one of his most ingenious accomplishments. But even Archimedes didn't figure on his simple machine being used for propulsion. That would take until the 1800s in England when the first screw propellers were patented and used on ships. These single and double screw propellers were met with much skepticism until they succeeded in sea trials and proved themselves far more capable and reliable than the paddle wheels that had been used most extensively at this time in history. We now jump to the year 1841 and come to America and check out a patent by Thomas J. Wells of New York. This was the first quantum leap forward in the modern vehicles we'll soon be talking about. Wells' patent was for a watercraft that was powered by a steam engine, turning two massive pontoons wrapped in the familiar helix of an Archimedean screw. Watertight, they would both float the boat and power through the water when rotational power was supplied by the onboard steam engine. There's no evidence that Wells ever built this craft, but his idea certainly appears as though it would have been viable, and it still would be today, as crude as it may strike us in the modern world. The next jump we must take is to 1899 and the patent of St. Louis, Missouri's Jacob Morath. Like Wells, Morath didn't actually finish building or perhaps even start building his idea, but this is the world's first example of someone proposing a ground vehicle to be propelled by screw propulsion. Morath's concept was basically a tractor. It would be able to drag plows through the earth, and the screws which propelled the vehicle would churn up roots and other soil impediments. As you can see, it would be powered by a small steam engine, which would turn some shafts that are geared together and eventually power the screws on the bottom of the rig. This machine was also equipped with wheels, so it could be transported on normal roads. Jacob Morath was a smart guy because despite never building his machine, he already intuitively understood the challenges that engineers would face some 70 years in the future. The year is now 1906, and a curious story shows up in a New Jersey newspaper. It's the story about a strange new type of, quote, auto locomotive being designed for a trip to the South Pole. Its description mentions a pair of brothers named Charles E.S. and Frederick R. Birch, then living in Minnesota. The Asbury Park Press, May 5th, 1906. Title, Vehicle for Polar Trip. Subtitle, Auto locomotive mounted on spirals invented by Minneapolis men. A new plan to reach the pole was described in a recent issue of the Minneapolis Tribune. The vehicle to make the dangerous journey is described as an auto locomotive, and the inventors are Charles E.S. and Frederick R. Birch. A test of the workings of the device is said to have been made in Lake Calhoun. The auto consists of four large spirals disposed of in pairs forming tracks. Each spiral has an opposite pitch to its fellow and so is disposed to rotate in the opposite direction, thus engaging the ice at different angles. Over these tracks is constructed a car to house the explorers. It is the belief of the Birch brothers that the vast stretches of frozen north are composed of practically smooth ice, or rubble as they call it, and their device easily can surmount these difficulties. They also have proved, they assert, that the machine can travel through soft snow of considerable depth. The model of the machine is alleged to have made 18 miles an hour over the snow and ice, but no mention is made of the fuel used. Neither is any computation offered to the amount that it would take to make it to the Arctic journey, and a matter of housing it. It is said, however, that the machine practically carves its own track from which it cannot deviate, and for unlike an automobile, it is impossible for it to skid. The Mr. Birches have combined the rigors of Alaskan exploration, they say, with their experiences in the quest of mineral wealth in the frozen regions. This led to their invention and to the construction of a working model. They entertain no doubt whatsoever that a machine built according to their ideas easily would reach the North Pole or even the South Pole if desired. End quote. So if we had to name one person as the official father of screw-propelled ground vehicles, Frederick Birch is going to be that guy. Birch had worked and lived in Alaska for years, and like so many others, he was there chasing dreams of mineral wealth from the mines and the harshness of that unforgiving environment. He was also an inveterate inventor. In the early 1900s, he patented a bookshelf design and even a parachute-style flying machine. But his 1916 patent for a, quote, motor sled that truly takes us into the real world of ground screw propulsion in the modern age. Birch filed for the patent for the motor sled on July 24, 1916, and it was granted in May of 1917. His intention with this vehicle was for it to transform the winter working conditions in the mining and logging industries that were so often dragged to a standstill when heavy snow came. Horse teams would sink, the ground was icy and treacherous, and moving logs or ore became virtually impossible. By 1920, Birch, who was now living in Seattle, was a successful lawyer, investor, and man about town. He had continued to refine his ideas, and he filed for another patent, this one for a, quote, snow motor vehicle. And while he is credited as the inventor, it carries another name on the assignee line, the Armstead Snow Motors Incorporated Company. Fred Birch was officially in business, and he had found the right guy to not only endorse his idea, but to make a bustling enterprise out of it. His name? Colonel H. Armstead. Armstead was educated at the Columbia School of Mines and during World War I established himself nationally as a major of engineers in the Army and then a colonel in the Officer Reserve Corps. He was known as a mining magnate with interests through the northern U.S., Canada, the Pacific Northwest, and others. He had engineered the construction of a railroad over the Rockies, opened and operated the American Smelting and Refining Company, and was the perfect man to pitch the snow motor to mining and logging operations across the country and the world. Fred Birch's name may not have come out of his mouth much when talking about the invention and the refining of the Armstead snow motor, but Birch was making enough money, he likely didn't care. The typical Armstead snow motor was based on a Fordson tractor. The wheels and axle were removed and bolted in place was a new rear section and the screw-equipped propulsion units. The machines worked as advertised and allowed loggers and miners to be far more productive than they ever were in the past during the winter. Reports of the time state that these things could go nearly 15 miles an hour on loose snow, which was blazingly fast for a tractor that typically made 5 to 6 miles per hour with wheels. Its most impressive attribute, and the one that Armstead demonstrated over and over, was its immense pulling power through snow and ice. Loads of tens of tons of ore, logs, even hundreds of people were loaded onto sleds and pulled around as a publicity stunt. The machine could pull things up grades that horse teams in the winter had no hope of. Once people saw the machine in person or in the newsreel-style footage that Armstead had shipped around the nation, the snow motor kind of sold itself. When the seasons changed, the whole works could be reversed and the wheels reinstalled for a normal operation on hard surfaces. Now, hard surfaces were the Achilles heel of the snow motor. Mud, snow, and sand were no problem, but hard ground was a major issue. The screws would have little to no bite, speed was barely better than walking, and it couldn't hardly pull a single man, let alone tens of tons. It was a problem which many smart men in the coming decades would try to solve. The company managed to make a few different versions of their product, even seemingly converting some cars along the way. Their promotion of the snow motor was relentless, especially in the winters. As you can see in this film, the machine was pretty awesome, and despite the frigid temperatures it had to operate in, it was a godsend for workers that got to use them. The machine operated with a pair of wet clutches where the axle used to be. Depending on the position of the steering wheel, they would release and engage, allowing an operator to very normally drive the machine and steer it as a normal tractor would be steered. It took a little time on how to learn to operate the Armstead snow motor, but once somebody got the hang of it, it was easy as 1, 2, 3. It's tough to trace the company history, but it seems as though it was a booming enterprise through the first half of the 1920s. In 1925, Armstead took his name off the organization. It's tough to know if that's because he sold the company or if the future was looking more challenging, but by 1930, the only record I can find of the Armstead snow motor is in classified ads with old units for sale. Safe to say it was a good run of about 10 years in business. It's also safe to say that these things were used up and then cut up, as there are a scant handful of intact snow motors left on the planet, sprinkled at museums in the northern reaches of the U.S., and yes, there's even one in Alaska. Here's a typical example of some of the promotional materials that found their way into newspapers across the nation during the early 20s when the snow motor made its debut. The Spokane Review, February 25, 1920. Title: Snow motor hauls ore loads. Subtitle: Dispenses with service of 4 teamsters and 16 horses at Port Hill. 7 tons to load. Makes round trip in 7 hours. Team occupied 2 days and run. Quote, the Armstead snow motor built at the Union Iron Works is now in regular service as a means of freight transportation from the Idaho Continental Mine, said A. Klockman, general manager, on returning from Port Hill, Idaho yesterday. Its merit as a passenger conveyance was established several weeks ago. It's since been equipped for freighting and has been making regular trips between the mine and the flume station 14 miles apart for the last 7 days. Quote, freight's up steep grade. We began its use in the freight service by coupling in a sleigh containing 5 tons of lead-silver concentrate. It pulled a load so easily we were encouraged to load 7 to 8 tons, which it handled with equal ease. We have since been making 2 round trips daily and can make 3. In 2 trips, we haul down 15 tons of ore. Freight or other kinds is hauled in the return, which is on a 3 to 4% grade. In 2 round trips daily, the snow motor operator by 1 man to 1 shift equals a performance of 4 teams of 4 horses each. A team occupies a day in descending the mountain and another in returning. The snow motor makes the round trip in less than 7 hours. The teams are handicapped in loose snow and by any condition other than normal, whereas the snow motor runs regardless of condition. We've taken off the teams and will use the motor as long as there is snow, slush, or ice, for it runs in any of them. Saves transportation problem. To test the machine with a heavy load, we stopped it both in ascending and descending a steep grade. It started readily from both positions. No braking is necessary. We ran it up a 25% grade between the mill and the crude ore station, a distance of about a block. The snow was unbroken and 6 feet deep. A horse could not have entered snow that depth. The snow motor has solved our winter transportation problem. The test reviewed by Volney Williamson, F.R. Birch the inventor, and Gordon Scott, a representative of the Union Iron Works, who spent several days on the road. I have been told that a motor is capable of hauling 20 tons and will be built next summer. Mr. Williamson said yesterday that the machine performed the work of the 16 horses and 4 men and would increase this to 24 horses and 6 men if Mr. Clockman operated on 3 shifts. J.M. Fitzpatrick, manager of the Union Iron Works, said the performance of the machine has been satisfactory. Major H.H. Armstead, chief owner of the snow motor patents, left last night for the East, where he expects to remain for a month. It is understood he intends to form a $10 million company for the manufacture of these machines. End quote. There are dozens and dozens of such stories that can be found in newspapers through the 1920s espousing the incredible technology and the incredible performance of the Armstead snow motor in harsh conditions. That being said, as I mentioned before, by 1930, it seems the snow motor had fallen out of favor with everybody, and that was likely because of advancements in other transportation. Now, it wouldn't be until World War II that screw propulsion would once again bubble to the surface. The brilliant and eccentric British mind of Geoffrey Pike wanted to land troops in Norway, mobilize them with machines that were wholly based on the Armstead snow motor concept, and send them into battle. The idea was squashed. The Germans dabbled in some small ideas, but nothing came of those either. In the 1950s, the U.S. government tested a weasel in Greenland. Now, the weasel normally had tracks, but they replaced those tracks with screws. And while no physical record of the test exists, it never advanced beyond the one prototype. The 1960s would see the largest resurgence of screw motivation, and it came once again from military needs. In England, Dr. B. N. Cole engaged in advanced research using theoretical and physical modeling of small screw-propelled machines. His work regarding the styles and construction of the actual screws themselves would be valuable down the line in the USA, but here at home a more immediate approach was taken. In late 1961, the Advanced Research Projects Agency of the U.S. military contracted with the Chrysler Defense Systems Corporation for the construction of 2 screw-powered amphibious vehicles. In late 1962, the first prototype of what would be known as the Marsh Screw Amphibian was in the hands of testers, and it was go time. The Vietnam conflict was illustrating to military leaders that mobility in swamps, rivers, marshes, and the muck of the Mekong Delta was virtually nil, and there had to be a superior method beyond wheels and tracks that sunk and failed miserably with regularity. The Marsh Screw Amphibian was designed with a unique feature, really a first of its kind in this realm. The aluminum spots and screws were filled with buoyant foam, and the theory was that this would be a way to reduce drag and enhance the performance of the vehicle in what was described as semi-fluid media, which means muck and mire. The contract stipulated that the machine needed to be capable of carrying a half-ton payload or 6 men. The engine was an all-aluminum, 116 horsepower, 225 cubic inch Chrysler Slant 6 that was governed at 3,600 RPM. The vehicle used a Chrysler 727 automatic transmission to turn the chain drives, which then spun the screws. The initial testing program called for 30 hours of water testing, 20 hours in sand, 20 in swamps and marshes, 5 hours on hard surfaces, and 15 hours of bank and ditch testing to see how the vehicle could navigate entry and exit from waterways and uneven terrain. The machine weighed 2,860 pounds empty. It was 13.6 feet long, set 8 feet wide, and just shy of 5 feet tall. The screw drums were 26 inches in diameter and just shy of 13 feet long. The machine had 20 inches of ground clearance when it was sitting still, and the whole thing was made of aluminum. The screws, the hull, and yes, even that famed Slant 6 engine. Not only was it run on the ground, it was test lifted and carried around with a CH-34 helicopter as part of the military requirements. Test sites in Virginia and Louisiana were used to simulate the conditions these vehicles would find in the Mekong Delta with different styles of soils, mud, and obstacles. It was also winter tested in the snows of northern Michigan. So how did it do? It could make 20 to 25 miles an hour in the snow. It could go 10 to 15 miles an hour in the mud, 7.5 miles an hour on calm water, and on hard surfaces, that was the problem. On hard surfaces, the vehicle was nearly useless, barely managing a couple miles per hour. In the final military reporting, some interesting observations were made. Most of them were not too flattering. Because of the open exhaust stack coming from the engine, 6 men could not be moved at a time. The fumes, heat, and general discomfort made the max capacity 4 people. The characteristics of the machine in terms of comfort were miserable. Fatigue on the operator and passengers being bounced and thrown over any undulation were graphically described in the report and became one of the main factors in receiving low marks, and it ultimately did receive those low marks. These are quotes from the findings section of the official military report on the Marsh Screw Amphibian, which was released in the end of 1964. In section 1.7, it reads, approximately 16 hours of operational time on the vehicle was required by operators to become proficient over most terrains encountered. Although all repairs on the vehicle were performed by the manufacturer's mechanic with assistance from military maintenance personnel, it was felt that a concentrated 2-week training program for military personnel with an automotive mechanic would enable them to maintain the vehicle. The Marsh Screw Amphibian was able to easily negotiate the following types of terrain: tidal mud flaps in the Appomattox River, vegetation-entangled waterways, floating grass mats, soft soils with vegetation cover or any surface where the MSA is in a float condition or with water furnishing sufficient lubrication to overcome friction forces which otherwise inhibited or restrained the rotors. The Marsh Screw Amphibian could not negotiate marsh terrains with no surface covering in water. Steering the Marsh Screw Amphibian could not be controlled when the vehicle was operated over uneven terrain or areas where the soil consistency was different under each rotor. Firm, moist soils devoid of vegetation did not provide lubrication for the vehicle's rotors and prevented movement in the forward direction. These areas could not be crossed by operating the vehicle laterally, but with poor to no directional control. The Marsh Screw Amphibian was able to negotiate vertical vegetated soft soil riverbanks up to 6 inches when exiting from the water. The speed of the Marsh Screw Amphibian when operated over mudflats having a cone pentarometer reading of 0 to 18 was 14.4 miles per hour empty, 12.5 miles per hour while carrying its rated payload, but decreased rapidly as the moisture content decreased in the soil. Personnel riding in the cargo area adjacent to the engine and the exposed exhaust system were subjected to considerable discomfort due to the extreme heat generated by those components. In warm or hot climates, this would reduce the number of personnel carried to 4. The cargo bed of the Marsh Screw Amphibian, as tested, was not suitable for transporting palletized or drummed cargo, but could be easily loaded with box cargo by hand or crane. No cargo tie-down facilities were provided. Ride characteristics including shock and vibration were acceptable over soft soil and water, but when the vehicle was operated over firm ground and banks, the erratic movement of the vehicle and lack of any suspension system subjected personnel to extremely uncomfortable tossing about and vertical shock. Downtime for repairs on the Marsh Screw Amphibian were excessive. Pilot number 1 was deadline for repairs 58 hours, including 34.5 hours waiting for parts for 64.5 hours of operation. Pilot number 2 was deadline for repairs for 62 hours, including 45.5 hours awaiting parts and 74.5 hours of operation. The Marsh Screw Amphibian must be transported between operational areas by a special trailer. If a suitable riverbank with sufficient water depth is available, it may be launched from the trailer like a boat, but otherwise must be lifted off by crane. The long and short story of the Marsh Screw Amphibian was that it worked perfectly in the very specialized mud and muck it was designed for, but had zero use anywhere else. It would have to be carried by truck or by air into the environment it was designed to be used in, and even then it was too small, too light, and to some degree not maneuverable enough to make sense. It was good at one very specific thing, but when it was even slightly out of that environment, it was a paperweight. On hard ground, the screws would be destroyed in minutes, all while producing the forward motion of a limping snail. It sure looked cool. With its aluminum Slant 6, it had some interesting elements. But otherwise, the Marsh Swamp Amphibian was relegated to the back pages of military vehicle history, an idea that simply didn't have any practical use in scale. So that would be it, right? Wrong. Only a handful of years later, with the conflict in Vietnam now raging all out, the mobility problem still existed, and the need still existed, and Chrysler had another idea on how to fix it. Horsepower. In December of 1968, Chrysler was awarded a contract to construct the Riverine Utility Craft, and this would be the big daddy of any screw-motivated vehicles ever created. Initial newspaper reporting suggested that the power for this beast would come from not one, but 2 426 Chrysler Hemi engines. It would be the biggest, heaviest, and fastest screw-powered land vehicle ever, and with that type of horsepower, we're talking about 900 plus here, It would on paper be capable of doing all the stuff that the little Marsh amphibian couldn't. We now quote from the South Bend Tribune of December 22nd, 1968. Headline, Contract goes to Chrysler. River Utility Craft is sought by U.S. Dateline, Detroit. The U.S. Navy Ship Systems Command has awarded Chrysler Corporation Defense Operations Division a $1.1 million contract to design and develop a river utility craft, RUC, that will transport men and equipment on twin screw-like revolving pontoons through shallow water, swamps, muck, bogs, water, and snow. Under the terms of the contract, Defense Operations Division will build and test 10 prototype models of this unconventional warfare craft. The first model is scheduled to be completed and ready for test in 1969. The unusual movement of the RUC models will be an improvement to that of the Marsh Swamp Amphibian, which Chrysler designed and developed for the Navy under Joint Navy Advanced Research Projects Agency funds in 1963. The experimental Marsh Amphibian is the first U.S. military craft to operate on rotating pontoons fitted with spiral blades. Tests conducted in some of the nation's most severe weed-filled waterways, marsh and swamplands have demonstrated that the Marsh Amphibian can outperform all types of conventional military vehicles in such environments. Powered by 2 engines. RUC will measure 20 feet long, 14 feet wide, and 8 feet high. Power will be supplied by twin Chrysler-built 426 Hemi engines of the high-performance variety. Chrysler engineers expect the RUC to have the same unique soft soil and water mobility characteristics as the Marsh Amphibian. This includes the ability of the hull to remain entirely free of mud or water surface because of the excellent displacement volume of the immersed rotors. The revolving blades on the pontoons also continuously clean themselves during operation in weed-filled water over muddy shoals and in marshy areas. In order to assure positive buoyancy, the cylindrical-shaped rotors will be filled with rigid foam so that the craft will float even if they should become punctured. The RUC has firm surface capability by rolling sideways with both pontoons being driven in the same direction. The designs and the rotor blades that reflect the research efforts of Chrysler conducted at the University of Michigan on various buoyant screw-type configurations. By November of 1969, the military had their fleet of RUCs ready to test. Chrysler was contracted to build 10 of them as opposed to the mere 2 Marsh Amphibians. With a payload capacity of 2,000 pounds, a gross weight of 13,000 pounds, and what turned into a pair of 380 horsepower Chrysler 440 engines instead of the Hemis, these things were beastly as compared to the toy-like Marsh Amphibian. The 2 big blocks were hooked up to a pair of 727 automatic transmissions modified to be 2 speeds instead of the 3 speeds as they were used in production passenger cars. Like the Marshes, they turned a series of chains that spun the screws to provide propulsion. With a speed of 16 miles per hour in the open water and nearly 30 miles an hour in swampy marshland, this thing was an unstoppable beast. Until it got to firm soil, where it once again proved to be helpless with a top speed of 4 miles per hour. But we'll get to that in a second. The RUC was put through the same series of tests and environments that the previous Little Marsh was. Once again, sites in Virginia and Louisiana were the bases of operation for the work. Some 134 different styles of ground were used, all of them meticulously measured for moisture content, density, and their effect on vehicle performance. And once again, some flaws showed up. The lack of any suspension system meant that the operators and riders were constantly pounded while traveling over uneven surfaces. The scope of the RUC was significant. 39-inch diameter rotors, it stood 11.4 feet tall, was 20 feet long, carried 340 gallons of fuel for those 2 thirsty Chrysler 440 cubic inch big blocks, had 49 inches of ground clearance, a width of 14 feet, and could climb a vertical earthen wall of 36 inches height. The vehicle was throttle steered, meaning to turn, one engine was sped up and the other was slowed down. Speaking of those RB big blocks, they were limited to 4,500 RPM max. Now this thing must have sounded glorious at full song, and it clearly threw muck and mire everywhere to the point that a canopy was suggested in the final test report to protect the occupants from flying debris and ground matter. At the end of the test period, when all was said and done, when all the muck was thrown, all the riverbanks climbed, and the swamps traversed, the conclusions about the Chrysler RUC were almost identical to the Marsh Swamp Amphibian. Despite being multiple times larger and more powerful and multiple times faster, it was still useless on hard or even hardish ground. It was too heavy to be flown into places and too specific to be used in a military environment where changing terrain and quick movements were necessary for survival. The physics of the big screw-powered vehicle in play, now since the 1800s, were just not going to be overcome. Big blocks be damned. Now, in typical fashion, the screw propulsion idea didn't die with the RUC. If anything, it inspired the Russians to make their own version. They completed some utility-style trucks, but ultimately they became the only nation on Earth to actually build and deploy screw-propelled land vehicles. Now, these showed up in the form of a small fleet of ZIL 2096 units, which were designed to ride on the back of a big 6x6 truck, where it would then be lowered off the back of the truck with a crane for its ultimate mission of tracking down cosmonauts who had landed in deep snow or other inaccessible areas of the countryside. Do they still exist today? It's Russia, who knows? Experimental vehicles with driving screws are still being tried to this day. You can find videos of them scraping their way around various surfaces and tilling their way through others, even looser ones. They're still weird, they're still slow, and they're still really, really good at chewing their way through swamps and grounds so soft even human beings would struggle to walk across. So there you have it, a history of screw-powered vehicles, military and otherwise. Who'd have thunk that Chrysler would be the company to have taken the lead on this, and beyond that, we can only be left to wonder that if the 426 Hemi would have been used, could it have helped the RUC perform well enough to be adopted by use in the military? The big 440s did all they can do, but it just doesn't seem like it was quite enough. Was the RUC the weirdest big block powered vehicle ever? I sure think so. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more historic, gearhead, and racing content.